So this week, as I watched the news, I have had a bone deep sadness about what's happening. And these words by Ann Parker came to me last night. So I wanted to offer them to you this morning. It is a poem called When the Unimaginable Happened. When we heard the news, watched the wreckage, felt the paralyzing blow, our hearts broke open and spilled out into our hands. And there we were watching our love seep through our fingers, watching our frail love pour out all over us, watching our love seem to slip away. When the unimaginable happened, the ache we felt, as if love was being lost, was the ache of love's despairing truth. This is the love that no one chooses. So out of order, so profound, the love we did not ever want to know. And yet the source of this despair, the reason our hearts cleave and flow, is because they have known fullness. This is the love of truth and beauty. Love that spans the web of being uniting each of us within its timeless form. When we heard the news, our hearts broke open, spilling into our hands. And there we stared at love, lamenting, what am I to do with this? And with these raw and tender yearnings, we will, beat after precious beat, seek wholeness once again. It will take some time to find our balance, to grieve, if we will make room. Remember, friends, this is the right thing, the ache within our deepest beings. Know that all these feelings are normal. To feel disrupted, empty, or undone. Our hearts broken open, and the love that is still true draws us together once again, remembering to restore us, mend us, piece by broken piece. This is the love that runs between us, this sustaining force of restoration, the love that nourishes and feeds us, binds us each to our collective core. We grieve, we march, we weep, we sing, and through the pain, not despite it. Knowing that love will repair us. Not the same, but stronger in some places. Honoring the memories like treasures, living our lives' potential in the shadow of the trespass, in the warmth of one another, in the light of what restored we will become. Let us take a moment now to be silent together as we consider these words. It has been a long time since I've had the pleasure and the privilege to speak to you. As Ken said, I think it's been over a year, maybe two, I'm not sure. And who could have imagined how much the world would change in that period of time? The way our politics have shifted, the ways in which the COVID virus has affected our lives, the losses that we have experienced in our communities, lives lost, jobs lost, a sense of stability and well-being lost. Personally, I've had two friends that have died from the coronavirus, and I lost my ministry in Hillsborough. The board decided in June to suggest to the congregation that in a year of being shut down, it was not fiscally responsible to keep me on staff. And while I understand their decision, it's been a difficult year. So for all of those who are suffering loss this year, my heart goes out to you this morning. And this week, who could have imagined what would happen this week? Wednesday, the day of Epiphany, the day that many Christians celebrate as the day God was revealed to unlikely suspects, the wise men and the shepherds. Who could have imagined that on a day such as that, we would witness what happened in our nation's capital? I try very hard to stay away from politics when I preach, but this week, the fifth principle of our Unitarian Universalist heritage, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in community at large, that principle has called me to a deeper reflection, spiritual reflection on this week's events. It has been 4 years now since we have had a president who has placed our nation's security, our democratic processes, and our well-being above his own self-interests. And we don't know yet how American democracy is going to confront the scale of the damage done by this departing president. The lies, the obliteration of norms, the repeated corruption and abuses of power, and then the incitement of violence this week is going to be with us for a very long time. Americans, we say, are more divided than we have ever been throughout history. And many of us are wondering how a democracy can stand when this is now the state that we find ourselves in. We blame the media, particularly social media platforms. We blame people who don't seem to be interested in listening to the truth. And we blame our leaders who seem to be knowingly peddling untruths to serve their own interests. We've seen this week where that leads, and there is a lot of blame to go around. All that being said, it is also true that half of the world has always had a difficult time understanding the other half of the world. And in fact, our Constitution was a compromise between people who had faith in the wisdom of ordinary people to choose their own leaders, and those who felt that a strong nation needed to concentrate power among wealthy aristocrats. So we've always had different views of what democracy should look like, and we've always carried our own maps, our own vision of reality. But these days, it seems much more difficult to see what the other side of the aisle is feeling. It has been easier to become stuck in our own stories, and this has made democracy so much more difficult. Robert Burton, who is a neurologist and novelist, writes that it is, in fact, incredibly satisfying to stay stuck in our own stories. He says that our brains will reward us with a shot of dopamine when we recognize and complete a pattern that feels familiar to us, that has some sort of resonance with us. Stories are patterns, and news stories are patterns. Our brains recognize the structure, the beginning, middle, end structure of a story, and they reward us with dopamine for clearing up any kind of ambiguity or unclarity about the meaning of the story. The problem with this trend, this truth, is that we often complete our stories without having all of the information that we would need to get to the whole truth of a situation. Because we don't need to be accurate as we complete these stories to get the dopamine flowing. We just have to be certain that it's true. I'm going to share my political leanings with you this morning by saying that when I am in the mood for a dopamine-infused evening, I will usually begin by tuning into the news on MSNBC, because I do believe that MSNBC tells me the truth, but I am under no illusion that they are telling me the whole truth. They are instead telling me the story that I want to hear. And lately, we've watched as folks from a different political story map than what I'm describing have been abandoning Fox News, going to other platforms such as Newsmax, because they are searching for stories that will validate what they already believe to be true, that give them the dopamine rush that they seek. Any strong belief will spur people to look for the evidence that supports the story that they already believe in. And I think this is important for us to remember because it makes the power of various authorities to change beliefs fairly limited. And we should remember this as we look for ways to correct the divisiveness that is now part of our common life. I've heard a lot of people say this week, we just need to start telling people the truth. And while I do believe that is the case, I also believe it has its limits in effectiveness. So I want to ask you this morning, how many of you have ever tried to watch a news program that has a story map that is very different from your own? And if you have tried to do that, how long could you watch before you just wanted to scream at them, telling them that everything they're saying is a lie before you turn the channel? It is incredibly different to listen to a different storyline. But I believe very deeply, even after what we witnessed this week, that if we want democracy to be less fragile, we will only do it by by challenging ourselves to listen to stories that are very unlike our own, to listen without judgment, to listen with some curiosity, to listen in order to learn, not to change our minds necessarily, but we're in a both and situation here where we need to stand up for what we believe and listen with intention and some imagination in order to understand. And so this morning we're going to do a little exercise together where I'm going to invite you to do that with me. We are going to get uncomfortable together for a few minutes as we slide into a story different from what you are probably unfamiliar with. And as we do that, I'm going to ask you first of all to remember that being open to the possibility of conspiracy theories is very commonplace, regardless of where you are on the political scale. It's very commonplace because cover-ups do exist. And so reasonable, and I want to say reasonable skepticism about what we're being told can be a good thing. I also want us to all to remember that there are some very smart, good-hearted people on the right who feel that questioning and doubting progressive ideas is an important national service because they see progressivism becoming mainstream. And once an idea becomes mainstream, it's even more important to look at the cracks in what the official truth might be. So with those things in the back of our minds, I want you to imagine that I am someone with center-right leanings, and it is March of last year, 2020. I'm watching what begins to happen as it dawns on Americans that this virus is going to be part of our national story. And I watch as state and local officials begin calling for unprecedented sacrifice. I pay attention to who seems to be asked to sacrifice the most. Small businesses, churches, families with school-age children, all institutions that are dear to me as a conservative, all institutions that I believe are the foundation of our democracy and our society. I watch also as liberal professionals begin retreating to their new home offices and Zooming in order to not lose their jobs. And I notice that Silicon Valley is expanding its influence and its wealth. And in the midst of all this, all of a sudden, I notice that none of these restrictions seem to be mattering as left-leaning protesters take to the streets. Everywhere I go for news, this is the perspective, this is the story that I'm hearing. And the more I watch, the more I read, the more I talk to my friends, the more this story gets fed back to me. This inequality in who is being asked to sacrifice. And I, somebody who has always been pretty lukewarm politically, am now beginning to get magnified. And now I can't help but see this as kind of a stage-managed, prearranged strike against people like me, and an escalation of power and money and influence against my president. I notice that there are COVID-inspired changes in the election process that will likely favor the Democratic Party, disenfranchising people like me. And I am not happy. And now this week, I watch as these liberal-leaning social media folks censor my president. Okay, I'm going to guess that by this point, a lot of you are squirming in your seats, as you should be, because this story that I've just told um, is so obviously blind to the experience of so many Americans. I call this exercise spiritual imagination. It was actually invented by Ignatius centuries ago, imagining why someone feels as they do. It is a spiritual practice that I feel is especially important right now, because if we are to make democracy less fragile, we need to somehow learn to listen to each other again. So this morning you might ask, how do we begin doing that with all the tensions that are in front of us, especially in the middle of this pandemic separation that we're having? And I'm going to make a couple of recommendations. The first one is that the truth is that listening to someone's story is always more palatable than listening to someone's ideas. So if you are hearing someone making a statement that makes you cringe, that you believe to be, incredibly wrongheaded, begin by asking that person if they have a personal, if they've had a personal experience that led them to feel that way. And if they can tell you their story, then maybe you can at least validate their story, even if you can't validate the way that they've interpreted that experience. And then you can tell your story, your experience of what has caused you to have the perspective that you have. Personal stories are always powerful connectors. Even if they lead to perspectives that we cannot agree with, we can at least share stories with each other. And the other thing that I would encourage this congregation to consider is getting involved in, if you haven't already, to get involved with broad-based community organizing. I know that the Industrial Areas Foundation has been working on getting a community organizing network started in Wake County. This is a model that we've used in both Durham and Orange counties. And it's a model that begins by getting lots of different congregations with different political leanings and different ideas together and having listening sessions on a regular basis, during which you're going to hear stories from people in other institutions that may be very different from your own, but this deep listening is an important step. And then out of those conversations, decisions by the group are made about what the community wants to focus on as what progressive actions they want to take together. I always recommend broad-based community organizing wherever it's available, because I believe that our democracy will only be healed from community organizations at the community level as we begin to again have conversations with each other. There's a story about Steve Jobs when he took over Pixar Studios, and he found that the studios were actually existed in 3 separate buildings, where they put the computer scientists in one building and the engineers in another building, and then the directors and editors and others in a third. And Jobs realized that his challenge was going to be getting these people, each group with their own cultures about how they worked, together in such a way that they could collaborate. Imagination, he said, takes various cultures and maps rubbing up against one another to work. And so what he did is he designed this huge cavernous space where everybody had to work. And not only did he put them all in one building, but he designed the building to have only 2 restrooms located in the very center of the building. And some people had to walk at least 15 minutes to get there sometime during the day. He knew that human friction creates the sparks for imagination to really take off. He knew that our natural tendency as human beings is to stay isolated in our own bubbles, with our own stories and our own cultures, talking to people who are just like us, people who speak our language, who understand our problems. But now, if you talk to people at Pixar, they will all have their stories about how under this incredibly difficult situation, they had great inspirational conversations with others. Sometimes while they were waiting for the bathroom, sometimes while they were washing their hands. At this time in our democracy, we have to create those imaginative sparks. The democratic process requires trust in the development of each person's conscience. And our 5th principle calls for a belief that such development is possible for each of us, because each one of us has value and a unique perspective, a unique story. Theodore Parker famously said once, democracy means not, I am as good as you are, but you are as good as I am. So at this difficult time in our history, we need to stand up for what we value, but we should not despair about our deep differences. We can rejoice in the fact that we are alive at such a moment of creative, imaginative opportunity. And a disruption such as we experienced this week should remind us that they often serve as great awakeners, reminders that we do have the power to make change, and that we do have the power to reimagine a new story that we can create together. I hope that we can rise to the challenge of our 5th principle as it calls to us as Americans. Amen, and blessed be.